I'm Joel Miller.
And I'm Jamie Bennett.
And this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy.
So here we are talking about Tobit, one of the most popular of the apocryphal books of the bad books of the Bible, one of the most popular. It's about a guy named Tobit. But before we talk about this guy named Tobit, let's talk about this guy named Jamie Bennett. Tell me, for the sake of our listeners, who are you to be telling me about Tobit?
Yeah, so that's the funny thing, because in a lot of ways, I'm just a regular guy. You know, I'm not like a well-known Bible scholar with a bunch of books to my name or something like that. But I'm somebody who loves Scripture. I'm a Christian first and foremost. You know, I'm a Christian in the Orthodox tradition. And I've studied Scripture for all of my life. But one of the interesting things is this was not part of the Scriptures I grew up with, as we mentioned last time. And so encountering these books, even having a master's degree in biblical studies, I've had to learn these books on my own outside of, you know, the academy. And so I'm just a guy. I go to a Greek Orthodox church. I work for an engineering company. I do business development. I do some music. I got a lot of things going on. I have a master's degree in the Bible, and I'm currently studying in a master's of theology program through an Orthodox institution.
Right on.
And so this comes alongside with my natural interests and inclinations. And then on top of that, you know, I regularly teaching at church. I teach the high school, Sunday school, and I also teach our Intro to Orthodoxy class. So when we talked about doing this project, to me, it felt like a real natural fit. You know, it complements what I'm already doing. And frankly, it gives me an excuse to study some books that I didn't study in school.
Yeah, totally.
How about you?
Well, like you, I did not grow up with these books. We talked about that last time. I encountered these books as I began veering closer to Orthodoxy as an adult. That veering process happened while I was an editor at Thomas Nelson Publishers. I worked in the publishing business for quite a long time, over a decade. And in that process, I've written some books, including a book about angels, Lifted by Angels is that book, in which there's a couple references to Tobit actually in that book.
Right.
My interest in these books came along with my journey towards Orthodoxy. Now I kind of just assume these books are you know, mine as part of that inheritance.
Sure.
And, you know, I have to like double up the layer on lay in terms of my qualifications. But I have been a reader of the Scripture, you know, most of my life, and certainly these books for the last decade, and love them. And I'm just really excited to be able to talk with you about them and share them with our listeners.
So now that we've explained a little bit about who we are, who is Tobit, Joel?
Well, Tobit is a faithful Jew, first and foremost, a faithful Jew in the exile, in the diaspora. Yeah. So in the captivity, even better to say. Sure. He is someone who takes very seriously the law, and to the extent of traveling from the northern kingdom, where he is a member of one of the northern tribes, instead of worshiping at the sort of like fake temple, he travels to the southern temple to worship. Yeah. He's very serious about his adherence to the law. And like a lot of other exiles in the story of the Bible, he's blessed for his faithfulness. Yeah. When you encounter like Joseph, for instance, you have a picture very similar here. When you encounter Daniel, you have a very similar picture here in Tobit, someone who is, while in exile, blessed for his faithfulness.
I think it's really important that you give that context, that he saw himself as a faithful person of God who would travel in honor of God. He would travel to the temple. You know, he was trying to do the things that he believed he was called to do by the Lord.
Yep.
And his name, right, is the Lord is good.
Which is a little ironic because of the trouble he gets into.
Sure.
That kind of gets into why we even care about the character of Tobit. It's interesting, just to say this real quick, that the first opening section of the book begins in first person. He's talking about himself in the first person, and then it shifts into third person. But he is talking about, I would do this and I would do that, and all of these things about like giving gifts and taking care of widows and orphans and all of that. Yeah. He is fully appropriating that holy way of life and communicating that to us, the reader, that's who he is and that's what he's all about. But of course, like a lot of faithful people in an environment that's not exactly friendly, he's been as part of the northern tribes carried off to Assyria. And so the book happens in a few different settings, but Assyria is where, like Nineveh, is where the main action, the opening action starts. And he's there because he's been taken captive. That sets up this dynamic of this faithful captive person, this person who's now in a hostile land, sure, who has to hold on to his faith. And that gets at why this story matters.
Well, and he was definitely, part of the displacement of God's people. And this theme comes up throughout the Old Testament, especially. And I think we can see elements of it in the story of Jesus Christ, where this idea of sin leads to exile and then the hope of return. So we see that played out in Tobit, just like we see it in other parts of the Old Testament.
Yeah, it's a theme that just, picks up like, I don't know, the theme from Beethoven's Fifth. You hear it and you go, there it is.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah. And also Tobit is specifically, many of the fathers would have seen this, right, as a love story, not unlike the story that is embodied in the person and work of Jesus Christ. The idea that a father sends a son out into the world to redeem a bride, to save a bride, right? Like these themes, there's so many rich themes that run through this book that we will be able to pick up on as we look at it.
I taught a Sunday school class once, and was surprised at how many of the kids, as we were working through some of this assigned curriculum, didn't know the scripture, didn't know the Old Testament, like didn't know who these primary characters were. They didn't know the history. They didn't know all kinds of things. And I was a little stunned by that. And I thought, I need to teach these kids the Old Testament, and I need to do it in a way that I can get through it in a few weeks, because that's not a lot of time to do this.
Crash course.
But how can we hang a bunch of stuff on some hooks that they'll remember?
Yeah.
And I remembered Tobit, and I just thought, I'll start with Tobit, because Tobit actually is the story of the whole Old Testament.
Right.
Tobit is the whole gospel story. But I basically told them the story of Tobit, and then I took a huge whiteboard and I wrote down all the books of the Old Testament, and I kind of plotted them along the plot line of Tobit, so they could get a sense of, oh, this is happening here, and this other thing is happening here. So a massive book of describing all this history could be condensed into just a quick summary for kids in that case. Yeah. So they could go, oh, that's that character, and this is what's happening in that scene, because they had another story that they could anchor it to. This is that kind of action. This is what's happening here. Right. And that was a lot of fun to do. And again, no spoilers. There'll be plenty of spoilers. We can't help ourselves. But,
chock full of spoilers.
But like you said, this is a gospel story.
I think, especially for kids, having spent a lot of time teaching kids, it's hard. Or maybe a better way to put it, it's easy to confuse by not having the things to hang it on. And when you have those things in place, not only are we've done a really good job, I think, in a lot of the children's Sunday schools, communicating individual stories from scripture, but we haven't necessarily done a good job connecting the dots between them and to the overarching story.
Totally.
And so a story like Tobit, if you get the chance to really explore it, it shows God's hand It shows hope. It shows that our situations are something that can be transcended, something that faith can endure beyond the difficulties of this life.
Yep.
And that message is all over Scripture.
Yep.
But it's not always made explicit unless we do a little bit of work.
Yeah. And I think you're right about that. The issue of kind of the connective tissue, like we get these isolated stories, and, Jonah is no different than Daniel, is no different than Joseph, is no different than whoever. It's sort of like, I just happen to know a couple of Bible stories or a bunch of Bible stories, but they're all disconnected. And if you can somehow show the overview of how all of that holds together, then you give people a chance to understand them as characters in this great plot. And this great plot that is there enables you to get a real sweep of the story, as opposed to just a bunch of small vignettes.
You mentioned several other Old Testament characters. There's an interesting potential connection with Job.
Yeah, there's a handful of things that are interesting about Tobit and his relationship to Job. Their wives are very similar, which is kind of an amusing thing.
Right.
They both experience unjust treatment at the hands of in the case of Job, like cosmic forces, and in the case of Tobit, it's much more direct. It's political.
Yeah.
As a result, they are, they are just like robbed of their ability to do very much. In the case of Job, he is, basically stuck there with his friends, trying to explain his perplexity at the nature of what's happened to him. In the case of Tobit, he starts off with this massive injustice inflicted on him. His property is taken away, but it's given back. He experiences a turn of fate, so to speak, and things go his way again, only to not go his way again. He loses his ability to do anything. He's incapacitated, and in his state of incapacitation, his wife goes to work. And there is an argument between he and his wife that actually feels very Jobin. In the midst of that, he shows tremendous patience. And there's a fascinating connection between that and James in the New Testament. When James refers to the patience of Job, what's interesting about that is that the book of Job actually doesn't talk about Job's patience.
Yeah.
But there's James teasing that out of something. When you read the fathers, they comment on the patience of Job. So it's present to them. So there is this connection between the patience of Job, and it comes from, or at least there's an allusion to it also in the book of Tobit. And that allusion happens in just one version, primarily the Vulgate, which adds some verses that you won't find in other versions of Tobit. But there is a specific reference to the trial that the Lord permitted Tobit to experience. And here's the rest of that quote, that an example might be given to posterity of his patience as also of holy Job. And it's hard to say where that line came from. Was that added later? Was it? It obviously was added later in some sense. We're looking at different textual traditions here, but it
was picked up by many holy fathers, and that theme comes up again and again. The patience of Job is one prism, but like specifically Tobit is remembered by the holy fathers as patient. Patience through the trials. I thought it was interesting to me to see how many of the fathers pointed to Tobit as an example. In the Christian world, it seems like anytime you're suffering or going through something extraordinarily difficult, people are reminding you of Job and his faith and patience through all of it. But Tobit is another such person. Tobit is an example of fidelity in the midst of difficulties. And he doesn't seem to lose his trust. Yeah. And that that faith is passed on and encouraged.
Yeah.
So when we're considering suffering, what were some of the things that Tobit was suffering with?
Oh my gosh. I mean, where do you begin? Well, I guess you begin with the text itself. Since we're reading Tobit, let's look at Tobit. Basically, the scene is set with Tobit having been taken to Nineveh. And in Nineveh, he is continuing to follow very closely the pieties that he observed back in Israel. That includes things like burying the dead. Mm-hmm. Now, where this gets him into trouble is Sennacherib, who was the Assyrian ruler, was not keen on this. And basically, Sennacherib punished him for burying the dead. He was going to kill him himself. Sennacherib had sent out an order to kill him. And Tobit heard about this, and like he hit the trail. He went on the lam and he hides out. And this works for a little while. Sure. All of his money is taken, but he keeps his life. And then, like a month later, 40 days later, not 40 days later, which is to say, like not even 40 days, Sennacherib's kids kill him. And, that's a win if you're on the lam from Sennacherib. And so his two kids knock him off, and like they hit the road, and there's a new king. And so he gets a new king is appointed. Esarhaddon comes into the throne, and Esarhaddon is he's favorably inclined towards our man Tobit, because he appoints a guy named Ahikar to take over some of his positions over all of the accounts of his kingdom, it says in the version I'm looking at right now. And
I want to say, I believe that is Tobit's nephew.
That's correct.
Right? Yeah. Which is an important next step.
Yep.
And he kept the signet ring, right? So he had significant authority.
Yep. He's like the right-hand guy.
Maybe literally.
Yeah, exactly. And that goes well for Tobit, because now Tobit is back in the good graces, and he is able to go and retrieve his property and all of that. Everything's been restored to him. But then there's a whiplash moment. He is going to celebrate Pentecost, and this is a very important celebration. In fact, the primacy of this celebration is actually why the book was read among Jews in the first place. One of the reasons. So like there's medieval use of the book of Tobit in synagogues, for instance, and it's around this time in the liturgical calendar of those synagogues where they would read Tobit. Basically, he tells his son, who this is an important figure in the rest of the book, Tobias. You'll notice that Tobias and Tobit are very similar names. They're actually the very same name. So Tobias is essentially junior.
Right.
And he tells him, hey, go bring anybody you can find into this Pentecost party that we're having. It's going to be a big deal. Basically, I'll wait till everyone gets here and then we'll eat. Well, then his son shows up and he says, Dad, I got bad news. Somebody's been killed. And Tobit immediately, it's whiplash. It's all over again. He's got to go out, get this body, bury the body, and now he's unclean. Now he can't even celebrate the Pentecost party. He can't even celebrate at his own party. And besides all that, he's in a state of grief. And so he lays down under a wall, and while he's laying down under a wall, birds above him crap in his eyes, crap in his face. And the bird droppings blind him.
That's pretty bad.
So that's what happened. So that is the start of the miseries of our man Tobit.
I want to draw attention to a couple things there. In particular, you talked a little bit about his charitable works and his his acts of mercy. So this is clearly a good man, right?
Very good man.
The scripture says
the best of men.
Yeah, absolutely. The scriptures say that, he wanted to feed the hungry and clothe the naked, and he buried the dead, which is a kind of clothing of the dead, in a sense. It's all part of that same charitable action and that love of neighbor.
And burying the dead is important in this context because they can't repay you.
Right.
There's no way a dead person is going to be able to give you anything back for the grace that you've given them. Yeah. And so this is like total self-sacrifice on his part, especially knowing that it's not even favorably looked upon by the Assyrian government.
And proper burial would have been very important to these people. We remember from Genesis where like Abraham purchased a cave to bury his wife. Mm-hmm. This became an important place, and this activity, this action of honoring your loved ones and your predecessors. But in this case, he wasn't even necessarily honoring people he knew. He was simply honoring his fellow countrymen. Yeah. And during a very difficult time where, apparently there were bodies on the side of the road more frequently than we're accustomed to seeing them.
I want to say something about the bird droppings.
I love it.
First off, the Douay Reams refers to this as hot dung, which you don't want.
Yeah.
You don't want hot dung.
Yeah.
But this is kind of a strange little bit of trivia here. There's a sense in which that this is not actually surprising that this might cause blindness. I'm actually looking at the Jewish annotated Apocrypha, and there's a note about this very thing, which refers to fungal pathogens in bird feces, which can cause blindness. Wow. And then it talks about Tobit having white films on his eyes, cataracts. And these are, of course, as they point out, documented in ancient medical writings. So I thought that was interesting. But I also found another reference interesting. This is a stretch, but it's worth just throwing out there. There are some ancient texts that refer to using bird dung for healing, including Pliny's Natural History. And I thought about that as I was thinking about what is a book like Tobit doing? One of the things it's doing is showing the properness, the elevatedness, the worthiness of a faithful way of life in a pagan context. So these books, these bad books of the Bible, these are written during the period in which the Greek government was over Israel. These were written during the period in which the Roman government was over Israel. And so these books are written in a political context in which Jews are in some sense subservient to pagan outsiders. And it's interesting that bird dung could be used in healing, and an ancient pagan may know that. And in this case, bird dung causes blindness. It's almost like a polemical jab of the writer saying this thing that you think of as medicine, no, it's blinding, it's poison.
I think that is really interesting, and it helps to put it in its context, because a lot of times we're missing some of the subtext in these books until we dig a little deeper. And you talked about the dominance of the Greeks and the Romans during this period where some of these books were written that we're talking about. And right here we're talking about the period of the Assyrian domination in particular. And I actually read recently, I believe the scholar was Sandra Richter, in the Epic of Eden. She described Assyria as the Borg of the ancient Near East. And I think she actually said in there,
you will be assimilated.
Yeah, exactly. Resistance is futile, And that's really the context in which a lot of this was happening. And this is the backdrop for what Tobit and his family has experienced.
Yeah, they are living in the Borg. So Tobit is blind, and he's blind for 4 years. As you can imagine, someone who, in his case, was a merchant, not able to see for 4 years would ding your income. Ahikar was able to step in and help, and his nephew, and that was helpful, but not enough. We know that it wasn't enough because Anna, his wife, also stepped in to fill the family bank account. She could weave, and so the story presents her as getting a job weaving. And there's a moment where she's very good at what she does, and she's appreciated by her employers, and they actually give her a goat, whether it's charity or a bonus or however you want to think about it. She has been given this gift of this goat, and Tobit hears the goat. This would be like if you had no money and the ice cream truck went by, and you heard that, like, the bell stops, the ringing stops, and then all of a sudden someone shows up at the front doorstep with like piles of ice cream.
Sure.
He hears the goat bleat, and he knows he doesn't have a goat.
Right.
This is a big problem. Where did you get the goat? So he immediately assumes that his wife has stolen the goat. Just to, I've been married for a while, but like, just a tip, don't go
don't
there.
Assume your wife is a thief.
No, that is, not really a good move. But he makes that move.
Right.
And this is one of the connections to Job's wife, is that now we are at the moment where there's the blowout between the two of them. And she says to him, that goat was given to me as a gift in addition to my wages. And he doesn't buy it. He tells her to return the goat. He's like too prideful, or too, I don't know what the word might be. I don't want to necessarily assume it's pride, but he's not convinced at all that she didn't rip off this goat. So she says, no, you got to go. He says, you got to go take it back. And then she responds to him. She says, where are your acts of charity? Where are your righteous deeds? These things are known about you. And this ends the chapter. This is like the moment that Tobit is flung over the existential cliff with his fingers barely hanging on the edge, because what his wife is saying in that moment is, yeah, you're the righteous one. You're the one who is doing all the right stuff. You're the one who observes the law. It's been a pain in my neck for all these years, but I went with you to Jerusalem. I did this, I did that. I did everything that you ever asked of me. Here we are. We're broke. We have nothing. I have been working. I get this goat. And though everybody knows that you're the good man, that you're the righteous man, nobody's doing anything to help. And especially God. That's the subtext. This is the moment where the truth of the story hangs in the balance. Is God a good God? Is Tobit, is faithfulness truly rewarded? Is all of those kind of like existential questions of, where is God? Where is the goodness of holiness? Where is the goodness of faith? All of that is brought into that one moment, that fight with his wife.
I had a couple of things that I picked up that I thought were pretty interesting. Commentary on this was St. Augustine brought up the idea that, basically Tobit's feeling that Tobit's concern was rooted in his righteousness. It was rooted in his desire to honor God. Now we can talk about the propriety of assuming it was stolen, but the urge was right. And St. Augustine said, it is better to be poor and insufficient than for a man to bring harm or theft by fraud.
Wow. Yeah.
That this idea that to steal is worse than even befalling poverty upon yourself. That was the kind of place of honor that he was coming from.
So not pride, honor.
But then I also think St. Cyprian talked about this a little bit, and he talked about her words and how they may have been somewhat of a temptation to him. That perhaps, that this idea of maybe she was calling him out in a sense, and he really wasn't sure what to do except to remain steadfast to God. And that through his steadfast faith in God, that, as Cyprian said, that he would come to deserve more of God through greater patience.
Right.
It's an incredible thing.
So when Job and his wife have their tiff, she tells him, curse God and die. And Tobit's wife does not say the same thing. But given the connection between those two books, and given the fact that the reader would know that Tobit's wife and Job's wife are comparable characters, they will hear that. Their resonance of that statement will be in her statement, in Anna's statement to Tobit. But Tobit doesn't curse God. Tobit does something else. And we're going to talk about that in the next episode.
I'm Jamie Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
And you've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week when we find out what happens with Tobit's existential dread.